Let's take a moment and consider God's presence with us here tonight. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the wonderful meal we had and for the families that prepared it, for the sacrifice that they made to do that for us. We also are grateful for our saint tonight, Saint Teresa of Kolkata. We ask that you have her be present here tonight to help everyone absorb at least one thing from her life and take it with them into their everyday lives. We ask also that you help us to mirror some of the traits that she had about her love of neighbor and her extreme love of just people in general and what she did to show that love. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. So as I said, St. Teresa of Calcutta. A lot of you guys have heard of her. A lot of people call her Mother Teresa. If anybody's done Love Begins Here, you hear a lot about Mother Teresa. Now that she's a saint, it'd be St. Teresa of Calcutta. Some people say St. Mother Teresa. They're all right, and we all know who you're talking about. She was someone. I remember when Mother Teresa was alive. She would have died right before you guys were born, but she's a saint of our times and a real example of what one person can do. I think it was no mistake either that God creates all of us individually in our physical appearance and in our spiritual appearance, but Mother Teresa was literally like 4'6". She was just a tiny, tiny woman. If you ever see her in a picture, even with Pope John Paul II, he wasn't that tall, and she's like a foot shorter than him. And so, but she was just an unstoppable force in her faith and in what she was able to accomplish, and we'll talk about that tonight. She was born in 1910, in a city called Skopje. It's now the capital of a country called North Macedonia, which is, if you know where Greece is, it's just north of there. And so it's kind of sandwiched between Albania and Bulgaria, kind of in that area there. She's actually an ethnic Albanian. There's a lot of the borders, that's one of those areas where the borders just change all the time. I bet you those borders have probably changed at least 4 or 5 times just in the 20th century alone. And so it's just kind of, that area's always been kind of a mess. It's just kind of in the crossroads of where conquerors happened when they would move through. But she was born, like I said, in 1910. She had 2 or 3 siblings. I didn't get too much into how many siblings and things like that she had. But she had a great example in her parents. Her dad died when she was 8, but the way he died was kind of interesting because he died, so like I said, this would have been 1918, so this is the tail end of World War I. So there was still a lot of civil unrest. And so they were pretty well off, and there was like a riot in the area, and the father went out to try and, rescue some people from that, and he wound up, I believe he was poisoned, but he was fairly well known in the area, so he was kind of assassinated. But this really left an impression on, she wasn't born Mother Teresa, her name was Agnes, is what her given name was. This really left an impression on Agnes. She saw the extreme gift of self that both of her parents exhibited. When there were people that were poor, they came to the door, they just gave them food and things like that. They took care of their needs, and this really kind of laid a good base for Agnes for her future life. By the time she was 18, she realized she had a call to religious life, and so she joined a convent of a group called the Sisters of Loreto, and they shipped her off to Ireland for training. So when she left, because of all the upheaval in the area, and the government of the country wasn't so friendly to people around it, she basically was saying goodbye to her mom forever. Her mom said, I'm not going to be able to leave the country to visit you, and they're not going to let you back in. But she knew what her calling was, and so she went for it. So she was, at the age of 18, she was pretty much knew she was saying goodbye to her mother forever. And so she got some training. Within a year or so, they were sending her to India to work in a school there. So that was in 1929, they sent her to India. And she spent the next 16, 17 years in the convent as a teacher. And India is kind of an interesting place because you have, there's no middle ground. You're either really rich or you're really poor. And there's literally like mansions right next to the slums. And it's really kind of an interesting mix of things, but they have this, because of the Hindu religion, they have this thing called the caste system. And so there's no upward or downward mobility. Whatever you're born into is where you stay. And that's kind of the accepted, mindset. It's like, okay, I'm born poor. I must have done something really bad in a past life because they believe in reincarnation. And so this is where I'm stuck to pay for the sins of that past life. And so if you're poor, you just know you're going to be poor forever. You don't work really hard and move up, and it's just kind of a much different system than we're used to. But she was in Darjeeling for a while, and then also Calcutta was where she finally wound up. And Calcutta has just got immense areas of slums, really, really poor conditions, really bad conditions. And so, but they were in this convent, and the convent was basically walled off. And so the rich people would send their kids to be schooled in the convent, and so they received a really good education. And, they didn't really have a whole lot of contact with the outside world. And so all this changed at about 1947, 1948, so after World War II. And she had taken the name Teresa after Thérèse de Lisieux. She was one of her heroes, Saint Teresa of the Little Way. And so she really kind of emulated that, kind of making her whole life a prayer. All the little tasks, she would kind of make that a prayer. And so she had to take a trip from where she was in Calcutta. I think it was to the mother house in Darjeeling. And this was it wasn't the first time she had been out in public, but for whatever reason, it really affected her. And as she's going to the train station, there's just crowds and crowds of people, and they're all poor, and they're all asking for things, for handouts, and she's seeing sick and dying people on the pavement, and nobody's doing anything. Because again, with this caste system, if that person is laying there on the ground, they must have done something wrong in a past life, and they just have to live that out. Whereas we're kind of like, I need to help that person. But that's not the way that they did things. And so she sees this person laying there near the train station where she was going to catch a train to Darjeeling. And and she's already kind of in this, she's really affected by what she's seen. And she goes up to this person who's laying there dying on the pavement, and she just kind of stays with him for a while. And he looks into her eyes and he just said, "I thirst," probably meaning, I'm thirsty, right? But this really struck Mother Teresa because she recalled Jesus on the cross saying, "I thirst." And it's really stuck with her, and she just couldn't get that image out of her mind. And when she took it to prayer, it just wouldn't go away. And so after a time, she's like, I feel like I'm called to do something different than just in this convent. I feel like I'm being called to go out into the streets and help these people. And people in convent said, well, that's not what our order is about. Here's what we're doing, and here's our mission here. And so, you can't do that. And so there was this one priest that was a friend of hers that was her confessor, and they were talking with the leader of the convent, the Mother Superior. And she said, you have a choice. You can either stay here or you can be laicized, meaning you can't be a nun anymore, and you can go out and help the people. And she said, well, no, I'm called to be a nun. And between that conversation and some other conversations had with her spiritual director, she felt called to start a new order. But there was a lot to this. And so it was like a year or two long process to kind of lay the groundwork for this. But eventually she was allowed to go out and be amongst the poorest of the poor. So she basically goes out with nothing. This convent that she was in, it was kind of the traditional habit, kind of the black and the white, that you see in a lot of different habits. but she felt called to do something different. And so you guys have all seen pictures of the Mother Teresa with the white garment and then the blue stripes on it. And she found that material, and she felt this is what those in our order will wear. Now at this point, she wasn't thinking about building the whole order. She was thinking about, here's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to be the order, right? But she just went, because I feel called to go out and help the poor. And so slowly over time, she starts having an impact in her area. She starts going out and helping people and just kind of tending to their needs. And this sounds all great. We'd be like, oh, this is all wonderful and things like that. But people in the area, they realized she was a Catholic. And Catholics at that time in India were like 0.5% of the population. There were not many Catholics. A lot of Hindus, a lot of Muslims. And the Hindus and the Muslims didn't like each other, and they didn't get along. So there was always skirmishes between them. But this met with a lot of resistance, especially from the Hindus. Because they were just like, you're here, you're trying to baptize our people, you're trying to convert them. And she's like, no, really, I'm not. I'm just trying to help them because I see that the misery that they're in, and I just want to do something. And so slowly over time, she wound up being able to get a small shelter. It was basically an old building, but it was a shelter that she was able to house some of these people in. And a few of the students at the convent, once they got out of school, they started coming out and joining her, and other people would see what she was doing. And suddenly there was like 12 of them, and they were really starting to have an impact in the area. And they were begging, for things. They would go into the marketplace, and some of the people in the market would give them fruits that maybe were getting almost too ripe to sell, or they would give them bread, and they'd give them all these provisions. And there was always seemed to be enough food for the people that she was trying to take care of. But the misery that she was encountering was so much more than what she was able to tend to. And there just always seemed to be more and more and more misery. And so not only was she caring for orphans, she was caring for people that were dying, and they would have different places for these different people. And again, some of the townspeople, they didn't like this. And there was a point where one time they were like throwing rocks at the building, and they were trying to force her out. And one guy goes in, and he's like, you need to stop, you need to leave. And she just kind of looks at him and goes, well, when we can care for these people here, when we get done with that, then we'll leave, basically is what she said. And the guy looks around, and he sees these nuns, and they're just taking care of people that are dying, and they've got open wounds, and they're just nursing them. And he's just totally taken aback by what he sees. And he goes back outside, and people are like, are they going to leave? And he's like, they'll leave once our people start doing what these nuns are able to do. And the people were just kind of shocked. And so they just started, they weren't out there professing Jesus Christ. She had a little crucifix on her shoulder, and she had a rosary, but she wasn't out there going, you need to come to Christ. She was just purely, through her actions, she was just loving these people. And they didn't get it. They just didn't get it because of their upbringing, but they were seeing that this was having a really profound effect on the people that they were serving. And so, like I said, over time, people started hearing about this. One of the, as it started growing, Rome sent a priest there to investigate it so that they could kind of make everything all official for this order. And he came there, and Mother Teresa kind of resisted meeting with him, and nobody knew why. They're like, why aren't you meeting with this guy? I mean, he can help you. And she's like, no, because there's some things about this that I can't talk about. I made a promise. And they're like, okay, like to who? But anyway, it gets to the point where this priest is there, and he's interviewing people, and he's a nice guy. He's just trying to figure out, I'm trying to help you take this to the next level, and it seems like she's not cooperating. But basically, the report gets back to her through her confessor. It says, look, if you don't talk to this guy, he's going to turn it down. He's going to recommend that this place be shut down. And she talks to her confessor and basically says, okay, here's why I can't tell him everything. And she basically reveals to her confessor that this message isn't something she's just feeling inspired to do. She says, Jesus himself has appeared to me, and he's telling me to do this. And so she's had the presence of Jesus and the Blessed Mother. She's been able to converse with them, like that, not just in prayer, not just I had an inspiration. Jesus is saying, I want you to do this. And she goes, if I tell him that, I told Jesus I wouldn't say anything to anybody, but also they're going to think I'm nuts. And then they're definitely not going to get accepted. Well, finally, she goes to the priest and tells him what's going on, and he's really he's really won over by what she has to say. And he says, I was going to not recommend this, but I'm going to recommend to the Pope that this order become a full-fledged order now. And so he does. And that priest, actually, he goes back and reports to the Pope, and he comes back and he says, I want to stay here and be part of this. And so he does. And this priest winds up staying and working with Mother Teresa for the rest of her life. And so he's just so impressed by it, because when he first showed up, Mother Teresa said, people show up here wanting to help, but they either leave right away within a week or they stay for the rest of their lives. And he was one that stayed for a very long time. And so word started getting out to various places kind of what was going on here. And suddenly they have different facilities in different parts of Calcutta, and their numbers are starting to grow. And this is really starting to become a big thing. And so in 1965, so this is about 15 years or so after the order started, because it started in 1950, she winds up traveling to Rome to present this to Pope Paul VI so that they can go outside the boundaries of India. But they didn't even have money for this airfare to go there. Her and two nuns were going to go, two sisters. And they wound up, it turns out that one of the guys that was running the airline was one of her students from when she was in the convent, and he remembered her, and he winds up giving her a free pass to go to Rome. So she goes and presents to Pope Paul VI, and says, we want to expand this. It's going. We've had a request from Venezuela. They want to start something there, and so, but they needed the Pope's permission in order to be able to do that, to go outside of the diocese or the Archdiocese of the area. And so he gives permission, and this thing starts to spread. And there turns out there's one that starts in Rome, there's one that starts in Venezuela, there's a couple other countries, I can't remember off the top of my head what they were, but it starts popping up in different areas around the world because people started hearing about this. They're like, this is really radical. I want to be part of this. And again, remember, this is like after World War II. The world has kind of gone through this, there's been a lot of people that have been killed, and the whole world has been kind of in an uproar. So then to have all that death and destruction, and now suddenly you've got this movement of, like, we're going to help people, that really left an impression on some people. And so this movement starts to take off. And money, it just always seemed that when they would need money, it just would always come there. They wound up having a gentleman from England, he wound up giving them a ton of money so they could build this whole big facility in Calcutta. And it was just the amount of money that they needed to be able to build this thing. And so Mother Teresa always used to say, if God likes this idea, he'll find a way to pay for it. And somebody said, well, what if he doesn't like the idea? He says, well, then he'll put it off for another time, and the money won't come in. But the money always seemed to come in for the things that, for the most part, there was a couple things that she had that didn't happen right away. They met a lot of resistance from local authorities, like with building permits, and they were trying to tie her up in red tape and all this kind of stuff. And she always managed to make things happen. Like I said, she was just kind of a force to be reckoned with, even though she was just this woman of very small stature. So anyway, so as time goes on, it becomes worldwide news, but there's also not just local people that are trying to tear it down. Our media was also trying to tear it down. So there were reporters in there, and they were trying to show all these, here's the bad things, and here's what's going on, and she's not being transparent with her finances, and the money's coming from somewhere, and there's just all these just false stories that are flying around about her. But she just kind of persevered through it. And one of the key elements of their ministry was time in front of the Blessed Sacrament. They would spend an hour. They would get up at like 4 a.m, and one of the priests would say Mass sometime in there. They'd have an hour of adoration, and before they even hit the streets, they had been like in prayer between Mass and adoration for like 2 hours. And one day things were really busy, really crazy. One of the nuns had said to her, "We have so much to do today, Mother. We probably don't have time to do our full adoration. We should cut it short." And Mother Teresa said, "Well, yeah, you're right. We're really busy. So instead of 1 hour, let's do 2 hours of adoration today." And so she always wanted to place it back at the feet of Jesus. Because she even said, she goes, "I can't, if it wasn't for Jesus, I couldn't do any of this. This is all his work, and he's working through me and inspiring me to do this type of thing. And anything he asks of me, I will refuse him nothing." And so she goes, if we weren't grounding this in prayer, it wouldn't be happening. And so we need to always root ourselves in that. And we always need to be among the poor. We can't be some agency out here funneling money in. We have to be living amongst the poor and eating what they eat and sleeping where they sleep and that type of thing in order to make this work. And this was, for nuns, this was a really, really radical idea. And so 1970s are happening towards the end of the 70s. In 1979, she wins the Nobel Peace Prize, which is an award given out Norway or someplace, I can't remember, but they give out this prize. And the prize, the prize is $1 million. And so she gets this money to infuse into the order, but she's not about the money. She's just like, I guess they needed to give me this award or something like that. Jesus must have some reason that he needs me to have this money. And so she would funnel this to project, and this is spreading worldwide. There was something like, at the time of her death in 1997, there was something like 4,500 or 5,000 nuns that had been in this order that she started in 1950. I mean, this thing just grew, it just exploded. But it was just like people just kind of fell in love with this idea of this type of service. And so she wound up, she died in September of 1997 at the age of 87 years old. So she was, and you see a picture of her, she looks pretty old. She lived a pretty rough life. She lived a full life. But one of the things that she was always worried about, she's like, when I die, I don't want this at all. I want to just live a humble, quiet life. And my life turned out to be kind of in the limelight. And on the day I die, it's going to be, I don't want all the fanfare. I don't want any of that. I want this to be just, I just want to pass and then let the work carry on. And so by some act of God's providence, the same day, and I remember this day when it was happening. I was over at a friend's house and when this happened, and there was reports in the news that Princess Diana had died in a car crash. And Princess Diana was now King Charles, right? It was Prince Charles at the time. This was his wife, and they had just recently been divorced. But she dies in a car crash the exact same day that Mother Teresa dies of old age. And so all the world's attention was focused on Princess Diana and not on Mother Teresa. So I remember hearing this, and I was like, kind of like, oh, Princess Diana and this, and they got all these reporters and things like this, and Mother Teresa died. And that's exactly what she wanted. She didn't want, because she knew that people were just gonna go crazy the fact that she had died. Now that said, at her funeral, there were leaders of nations that went to that, and it was a big deal when she died. But a lot of that initial, for lack of a better word, excitement about her, or all the fanfare, was quelled because of Princess Diana's death, and the media attention was all on that, which is what she truly deep down wanted. So most people, though, knew when she was still alive that this woman was a saint. I mean, she was going to be a saint. She's kind of like, if she doesn't make it to sainthood, we're all screwed. It's just like, we're not going to make it because of all the things that she's done. And so her cause for canonization was opened pretty quickly. She was beatified by Pope John Paul II, who she wound up being good friends with. Whenever she was, going by Rome, she would stop by, and Pope John Paul just had a real admiration for her, and there's lots of pictures of them together, and they just had a close friendship. But he beatified her, and then in 2016, I think is when it is, I can't see my thing, 2016, she was canonized by Pope Francis. And so she's only been a saint, a named saint for about 6 years. But those of us who grew up, when she was alive, we knew I wasn't even that much into my faith. I'm like, yeah, this woman, she's doing something pretty spectacular here. So, there's so much to her life, and just like I said, her radical approach to her love of the poor. And it wasn't like she just was caring for them. She would be right down in there, and she would be like, her and her sisters would be like picking maggots out of the wounds of the people that were dying. And they would just go out and they'd find people dying in the street, and they would bring them in to their hospices, and they just wanted to give them a place to die with dignity. They knew they were going to die. They knew they couldn't do anything, but they just wanted to bring them up to the level of dignity that each human person has. And again, she won a lot of souls for Christ, but she wasn't out there sitting there going, you need to convert to Jesus because you're Hindus and you're all going to hell. She wasn't doing that at all. In fact, quite the opposite. She was loving them right through that, and that converted a lot of hearts just along the way that way. So, she would always say some similar things like Saint Teresa of Lisieux would say. She would say, like, do small things with great love. Was one of the things she said, and Saint Teresa said something very similar. Just making the next right choice, but it always came back to prayer, right? So it wasn't all God, right? It was all God and her action. And it wasn't just her action because she needed God. So it was both and. And so that's the example that you should take away from this, that all of the good works that you're going to do need to be tied to the Lord somehow. We can go out and do good works, and that's great. But we need to be doing them as an offshoot of our faith and as an offshoot of our prayer life. That's when it really has power. And like I said, this one little 4'6" woman from the middle of Eastern Europe wound up changing the lives of millions of people just because of her radical love of the people around her. So that's the example that I would take away from this. Any questions? Claire?
Did you say there were 5,000 sisters when her order was?
Something like that. I saw different numbers. You said like 4,500 and 5,000. I saw that number. And there was also all these other people, what do they call them, co-workers or something like that, that would just be lay people that would be helping too. And just so many people that were part of this. Hazel?
Why didn't you talk about her dark days? About the fact that there was a long period of time, I think it was like 40 years, that I said that she was able to talk to God.
Mostly because I forgot about it. Right, she had visions of Christ and of Mary, and then that was taken away right around the time the order was started. And so she did all this stuff despite despite the fact that she was no longer getting any kind of consolation in prayer. And so she had a dark night of the soul, spiritual dryness times 100 for almost 50 years till her death. And but she still exhibited joy, and she would say to people, he says, those in our order need to show joy. And again, it was just part of her total trust in God. So yeah, I mean, we all want it, right? We're all like, oh, give me a sign, God, if I should do this or if I should do that. And she didn't even ask for that, and she was getting that initially, and then that was totally taken away. So she could have easily despaired and said, okay, I guess God doesn't want me to do anything with this anymore. But she was still getting inspirations, and she would still see people in the street. I watched this one movie, and whether or not it was actually happened or not, who knows, but she was talking about this to one of the priests, the one that stayed in India, and he said, God will not abandon you, just persevere, basically. And then shortly after that, she saw a man lying in the street, and she went up to him, and he said something to her like, what are you looking for? What are you seeking? And she, not so many words, said, I'm seeking to know that I'm doing the work of God. And he made a comment like, a good employer never forgets the work done by his employees. And she took that to mean that was something that God was maybe passing along to her. So yeah, so I'm glad you brought that up, Hazel, because I just spaced out on it. So we are going to do our Decade of the Rosary, and like I said, we're going to, I talked a little bit about the theme, this love of neighbor is the second of the joyful mysteries, the visitation. And the fruit of that mystery is love of neighbor. And so that's why Mother Teresa is a natural for this one, because of the radical love of her neighbor that she had. And neighbor meaning when the rich man asked Jesus, who's my neighbor? And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, right? Which is like everything Mother Teresa did. She would go out and help people she didn't even know, but she just loved them as if she was, as if it was Christ loving them through her. And so, you know, it was an interesting, this love of neighbor that she held. It was almost like, it was just so extreme, and I don't mean extreme in a bad way, but it was just so intense that it just steered all of her actions and everything she was doing in her life. And so that example that we want to take from that is just, you know, do we have to go out in the streets and nurse and minister to the poorest of the poor? Maybe, you know, I mean, I know that's kind of what we do when we go on Love Begins Here is we go and help people, and we, you know, some of the jobs aren't glamour jobs. You know, you're scraping paint and you're digging weeds and you're trying to think of some of the weird stuff, cleaning out people's who hoard stuff and clean out their barns and all this kind of stuff. That's, you know, it's not fun, but we do it anyway. I mean, you can't tell me that it was fun for Mother Teresa and her nuns to be picking up diseased and bleeding people on the street and nursing them, knowing that they were going to die, but just, you know, being with them. I mean, that was no fun, but they just did it, and they did it with a smile on their face, and it's like, I couldn't do that. You know, I mean, I'd like to think I could, but I can't tell you I would. And so I looked to her when those instances occurred to try and say, all right, how should I love the people that are around me right now? An interesting story that a friend of mine's wife had a devotion to Mother Teresa, and she was the type of person Mother Teresa was. She was very giving. She was like the president of the Right to Life in her county and all this kind of stuff, just super giving person. Well, she was sick for 5 years or so, and then she just died on Labor Day, which was September 5th, which is Mother Teresa's feast day, and it was the 25th anniversary of her death, and my friend who had a devotion to her died on her feast day. So we all thought that was pretty cool, because it was like, okay, that makes sense. Because there were so many times when they were like, how come, and this is gonna sound bad, how come she hasn't died, right? She's so sick, you know, how is she hanging on? And she wound up hanging on to the feast day of a saint that she had a strong devotion to. So I thought that was pretty cool. So, so you know that Mother Teresa was certainly with her, I'm guessing, when she died. So that's something to take away from this, is that this love of neighbor can have a profound effect on our lives. And so it's something we should all try and emulate.